Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com, and you are tuned into the Geneva Business Insider, that monthly program where we talk to David L. Smith in Geneva, Switzerland, about all the things that are happening in the world of finance, economics, politics, society, geopolitics, and scandal generally. Of course, he is available at genevabusinessinsider.blogspot.com, and that will be linked up in the show notes for this interview, as always, at CorbettReport.com. David L. Smith, thank you once again for your time.
It's a pleasure. I didn't know we do all those things, but I guess in reality we do.
Well, it seems we do have something different to talk about every month, and we have something different this month as well. We do, as I say, talk about scandals generally, but often in the economic or financial world. But let's talk about a scandal that's affecting your former country of origin, I suppose, the United Kingdom. It's not really a country, but let's talk about that a certain scandal that's going on there right now related to pedophilia, which unfortunately I'm sure many people have seen some of these details coming across the news wires. But for many people who aren't in the UK or aren't following this, they may not really understand what's happening here or what the scandal's all about. Perhaps you can fill us in on this and give us some of the details about what's coming out in these investigations.
Yes, okay. Well, the first thing I'd have to say is I'm not an expert in that particular matter, but I can only comment on what I've read over time. But it does seem pretty much for certain that there have been serious pedophilia problems amongst British elites, be it political, economic, or high-profile people, which has been covered up literally for generations. And if we look, we have seen recently Jimmy Savile, who was always someone I had a creepy feeling about, who was always hanging around young children, organizing TV programs for young children, and very present in the BBCs for decades. And he also appeared as one of these do-gooders who was going to charitable organizations such as hospitals for the handicapped and being there as well. And unfortunately, the dark side of this dreadful man has come out, and the abuse that has been going on has been grotesque at a very minimum. And it has involved young children, both men and women. It has involved suggestions of necrophilia, which is just beyond all imaginings. And of course, a little bit like in the banking sector, where anything that goes wrong, it's just a rogue trader who was somewhere way down the hierarchy and the top management never knew about it. The same game is being played out again. But there seems this time to be a little bit of movement behind it because the press has caught on to it. There's some excellent press in the UK, one of them called XRO News, who follow this kind of thing. They're a kind of independent journalists who report what other people don't report. And they have been exposing for years the allegations of pedophilia, literally going back for 30 years, very often involving state-owned and controlled homes, which you find that the boards of directors of those homes are frequently politicians who have been profiting from the situation. And there have been cases in North Wales which would appear to have involved certain grandees of the Tory party. There have been events in Jersey where the same thing has been going on, and investigative journalists have been refused permission to stay and visit on the island and make any inquiries. We see this in Elm House, which is a neighbourhood very near to London. And we see this also in Sheffield and the northeast of England. And there is one thing that is for sure: human behaviour has not changed in the last 30 years. But the names and places and people that have been proposed the suggestion is this all happened 30 years ago and it isn't an ongoing phenomenon. Well, I mean, this is beyond all possible belief. Sexual deviance has not stopped. It is prevalent, and wherever it existed before, even if it has been pressed down to a lower level or moved somewhere else, it is still going on. And of course now our friend Mr. Cameron, who has finally been cornered into having to do something about it, after having a string of national newspapers actually coming out and saying something. And of course their version of the truth is extremely limited because they're afraid of libel suits or D notices or all kinds of other things being slapped upon them to prevent them, or just simply government interference saying, you know, if you want to have trouble with us or you want to renew your licenses, just put your nose a bit too deeply into this and you'll find that life gets extremely difficult for you. So the mainline press is extremely circumspect. But at the end of the day, one has to think of the horrible lives that some of these poor defenseless children actually suffered, where their greatest adventure was being molested by someone like a Jimmy Savile in order for an outing beside the sea and an ice cream on a Saturday afternoon. And these are the people that are being subjected to it. I did have indirectly some slight awareness of this when my mother, in fact, was a school teacher in what was a Roman Catholic school in Scotland. And she said some of these children had, when she was teaching them as kids, they seemed to have something severely wrong with them. And then later in life, there was an inquiry on Scottish television where it turned out that several of the kids that she'd been teaching had actually been abused in the school, and she was traumatized by the fact that she hadn't understood what was going on and hadn't been able to help. So this is why I think these things, it's very important to talk out about it and say what is going on, and it is a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, if you look at, in the US, there was Boys Town in, where was it?
In Omaha, I believe?
Omaha, a long time ago. Same dreadful things, politicians, big business, people who inquired a little bit too closely suddenly get suicided in series, and politicians who were honest suddenly find their financing and sponsorships from larger companies withdrawn. So this is really probably the ultimate no-no, because if we look at the world, 30, 40 years ago, for example, homosexuality in the UK was actually against the law. Now, the world has moved on and views these things completely differently. But if you have someone who's a pedophile, I mean, you have the ultimate control over him, as Catherine Austin Fitts said in one of her articles. You have control files on important politicians, businessmen, and you know perfectly well that by allowing them to continue their deviant behavior, you can decide policy on a large number of things. And this can be judges, people in the police force, people in the military, people anywhere. And it is a cancer that absolutely has to be cut out of society. And I hope that David Cameron, when he's saying he wants to get to the bottom of this and leave no stone unturned, I hope when he turns the stone up and he finds the cockroaches, he doesn't gently lift them up and hide them somewhere else, which is a tendency of the British elites and other elites as well.
Unfortunately so. Well, I think you just gestured towards the answer to this question, but let's tease it out a little bit more. It seems that pedophiles and necrophiles and rapists and other sexual deviants of various sorts are overrepresented in political and financial elite circles. And perhaps that's just a perception issue. Maybe if you really scrutinized the general public in the same way, you'd find a similar percentage of deviants. But it certainly seems that there seems to be a lot of these types of rings in positions of power. Why is that? Why do these people seem to congregate in positions where they're able to use and abuse their positions of influence? And how do they end up there in these circles?
Well, to me, power creates opportunity. Money creates opportunities. Stardom creates opportunity. I mean, the ordinary guy going, or ordinary family, say, visiting a church home where there are orphans, they're going to go visit. They're going to be very sorry about what they see. They're going to tell their kids how lucky you are not to be in that situation, and they're going to leave some money behind. But none of them would think of it as a predatorial opportunity. You would not look and say, well, those kids, I can do with them what I want. I can take with them where they want. All I need is to place a couple of people on the board of directors or in the general management position. I will do what I want, or pay the matron to make available on the Saturday evenings, or all these kind of things. And unfortunately, as we know, power and money corrupt. And that has always been the case. So these things create opportunity. I think that is essential. And the people who seek power as well, per se, over others. I mean, politicians are, by definition, do not represent the normal person, because the normal person does not seek to have control or say over over an electorate. A politician does. So it is a natural extension of that to say, well, maybe I just apply it in different domains. And we have seen very clearly the two-tiered justice system that exists practically in every developed country now, where people with power and privilege are subject to a different set of laws or not subject to the laws at all. And if it becomes firmly embedded in their minds that that is the case, and they have special relationships with people who also have a position of power who can cover these deviant acts, then I think that is it kind of feeds upon itself. And again, because it's pedophilia, there has to be a conspiracy of absolute silence, because everyone who's involved in it has a very difficult path to walk if it ever becomes public, and they're quite prepared to be completely ruthless in ensuring that that veil of secrecy is maintained, and they're quite prepared to be equally ruthless with their victims.
And if I'm not mistaken, Conspiracy of Silence was actually the name of a book, I believe, and a documentary about the Boys Town Franklin cover-up scandal, so worth looking into on this subject in particular. Well, perhaps we should just put on record some of the details of what we're talking about. There is an RT article that I'll link to in the show notes. At least 40 UK politicians complicit in alleged Westminster pedophile ring, according to a report. A whistleblower who kicked off UK police pedophile probe Operation Fernbridge believes as many as 40 British MPs and peers were involved in or turned a blind eye to child abuse. Peter McKelvey, a retired child protection team manager who has spent more than 20 years compiling evidence of alleged child abuse by people in authority, believes 10 current and former politicians are on the list and that there is enough evidence to arrest at least one senior politician, reports the Daily Telegraph. MPs and peers from all three main political parties are on the list, including Cyril Smith and Sir Peter Morrison, who are now dead. And I don't know the details of these people. I'm not that familiar with British politics, but I'm assuming that these are names that would be familiar to a lot of Brits. And the question, of course, as always, is what will actually become of this Operation Fernbridge, and how it will it play out? Will anyone actually be brought to justice, or will a few people get thrown under the bus and the rest covered up? Of course, that remains to be seen, but David, do you have any feelings on what we're going to expect from the way that this operation will unfold?
Well, I have a degree of optimism because the normal person in the street is horrified by this kind of thing. And while you can kind of say, well, the bankers rob us and make a joke out of it, the imagining that the person who represents you in the Houses of Parliament is doing sordid things to young children is horrendous to 99.99% of the population. And it's interesting in the Houses of Parliament, where basically they're prisoners of their corporate owners, that there's even 20% of the British Houses of Parliament who are demanding a cross-party investigation. And of course, the trouble is, this is at the highest levels, and I am sure and certain that people at the highest levels have a good idea what's been going on and have been ignoring it. And I think there are two people who are going to be extremely embarrassed by this, and one is Mr. Cameron, and one is Mr. Clegg, both by association, but I can say no more than that for the reasons of libel, but we'll see what comes out of it at the end of the day.
Well, we certainly will, and let's continue to follow this story and perhaps have an update next time so that we can talk more about the investigation as it unfolds. But again, this is a very serious issue, and at the very least, it is good to see some of these details coming to light, although I'm sure there's still a lot more cockroaches scurrying around under some of these unturned rocks, and unfortunately it's probably true if you see one cockroach, there's probably 100 more within striking distance, so we'll definitely have to continue to see how that unfolds. Let's turn to another geopolitical matter this time, and what that's unfolding, and a very important one that has really disappeared from the mainstream radar in at least to a large extent, certainly from where it was just a few months ago. And of course, that's the current situation in Ukraine. And the latest vile piece of propaganda coming out from the U.S. State Department via voiceofrussia.com, U.S. State Department recognizes right of Kiev to apply airstrikes on civilians. U.S. State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki said to reporters at a press briefing that the Ukrainian government has every right to conduct attacks on civilians, as this upholds the unity of the country. According to U.S. State Department spokesman Jen Psaki, the Ukrainian government defends the country, inflicting airstrikes on civilians civilians in the east of the country. She stated this today at a regular meeting with reporters. Psaki justifies Kiev's actions in relation to the militia. So, a pretty stunning thing to say, but perhaps not so surprising for a country that specifically allows for the use of airstrikes to assassinate its own citizens, as the United States does, and has successfully done in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son. Again, what an unbelievable thing to come out on record and say it's perfectly fine for this government to apply airstrikes against its own people, whereas, of course, that was ostensibly the reason that we had to get rid of people like Saddam Hussein, because, look, he attacked his own people. What do you make of this absolute two-faced hypocrisy?
Well, I hadn't heard that specific thing, but I have to say that Psaki, for me, is not the sharpest knife in the drawer anyway. I mean, she's made a spectacular series of dumb comments on this situation. And yes, I think the US government entirely supports this policy. And the IMF more or less does the same thing, because their position on providing financing to the Ukraine is conditional upon the country remaining intact, which basically gives the Kiev government the choice of we get so many billion if we agree to some kind of separation with the East, and we get so much more if we keep the whole thing together. And then what you do, of course, is you bring in a puppet a president who applies U.S. State Department policy in the name of the Ukraine and the Kiev government, and that's perfectly all right. And then you have someone like Psaki who comes along and says, well, this is acceptable policy. Well, nowhere have I ever heard that that's an acceptable policy. And I have to say, I come from Britain, where we had our own share of problems in Northern Ireland throughout my lifetime. Even when I was, 40 years ago, people were being killed, and nothing was ever achieved by doing that. And we now have a terribly, the brutalities of, there were a few unacceptable acts by the British forces on the ground, which have done nothing more than create martyrs and push away the peace settlement for many, many years to come. So what is being done now is just, it will drive the separatist movement underground, perhaps temporarily, but it will just lead into a long-term low-intensity civil war going on, and there's nothing that's going to stop that, and I'm sure that there'll be people quite happy to finance it. And the ordinary citizen in the street is going to be walking home in fear every night, whether he's going to meet his neighbour who happens to have a different political belief, or he might be attacked by gangs who are patrolling the streets. I mean, the whole thing is dreadful, and for America to be the moral guider of the world as to how things should be done, I mean, this is absolutely atrocious. What else can one say?
Well, certainly dreadful is the nicest term we can apply to this, and even beyond the morality of what's being proposed here,
one could even say it's inciting people to war crimes.
It is a war crime, I would say, to be attacking one's own civilian population. But I mean, even aside from the moral issue, there's the strategic issue. And exactly as you say, the idea that you're somehow going to unite a country by killing portions of the country off is so bizarre, is so nonsensical on its face, that it seems like a policy that is destined to fail, and one that I can't imagine Kiev actually believes will somehow unite the country. So it makes me wonder what the actual agenda is here and how they really expect this to play out. And of course, that also brings up the question I mentioned earlier, that this does seem to have dropped off the mainstream media radar. So why is this suddenly a non-issue? Why is it suddenly inverting 180 degrees from common sense? And where is it going to go from here?
Well, I think we're back to cakes and circuses, aren't we? I mean, if you look at the recent weeks, we've had nothing else but World Cup football. And of course, World Cup footballs are great times to get on with war crimes. We also in the UK have had particularly the Wimbledon series, where we have our good friend, our Russian champion, who actually won it. But all of these things are major distractions to the public. The weather's nice, people are going outside. And, the brutality that's going on in the rest of the world just gets quietly buried because, well, of course, it doesn't really matter. And of course, in the UK, they've also had this salacious distraction of the pedophilia story with geriatric actors who are either on death's bed or already dead, being served up to the public as saying, look at this dreadful thing that happened all those years ago. And the people involved are public figures that the entire British public have known since they were school kids. So this keeps everyone very distracted. It's just cakes and circuses, literally. And have you heard anything about Syria recently, which is even more off the radar?
Yes, certainly not. Even ISIS and what's happening in Iraq, again, has slipped from that mainstream radar, at least towards the periphery. So, again, there's a lot of things that are going on, and we could even, I suppose, bring in the strikes on Gaza that are apparently taking place as we record this conversation. Details just starting to emerge about that, so a lot of things that are, again, not being reported on because, hey, it's summer vacation time. I guess it's time to go off and go camping in the woods and forget about all of this. So it is a time when we have to wonder about what's being covered up. And let's turn finally to something that is playing out again in your neck of the woods in Europe right now, where the European banking sector seems to be, if not in crisis, certainly showing signs of being in some sort of crisis mode. And we can pick that up from some of the headlines that are coming out. For example, Bloomberg, European banks seen facing $50 billion more in legal expenses as they start to catch up on their U.S. counterparts and the types of legal expenses that they've faced in recent years. We have this from the Irish Independent. Mega fines will hurt European bank dividends. Oh no, let's not fine the banks. It will hurt their dividends. This from FT, Financial Times. EU banks look to shed loans worth £100 billion. And also from Financial Times, European banks raise capital ahead of stress tests. A lot of worrying signs coming out of the European banking sector, and some of this swirls around about an interesting story that took place just last week where Hungarian lawmakers passed a law that was going to require banks to refund their customers on spurious loan fees up to 28 billion euros worth, which affected Austrian banks primarily, as Austrian banks are heavily invested in Hungary, in Bavaria, in Romania, and places like that. So this caused some problems with the Austrian banking sector, and of course, the European banking sector generally came out and said, you can't pass laws like that will require us to pay back spurious loan fees because it will hurt the banking sector, and you don't want to hurt the banking sector, do you? So once again, it looks like they've got the gun raised to the head of the economy and are going to use that as the threat to try to keep their own profits nice and tidy. But even so, we saw European bank stocks plunging last week. So tell us a little bit about what's happening in Europe with regards to the banking sector and what we can expect from here.
Well, it's once again, it's a big question. I mean, the European banking sector is purported to be in good shape. It has been purported to be in good shape for years. Mr. Draghi said everything is great. It's been so good, in fact, that they had to inject over €1 trillion in order to temporarily stabilize it. So, of course, if it's in such good shape, you should just take that money back now. So, of course, we go through the charade of stress tests, which are basically testing things which are meant to be reasonably solid and not looking at anything that are known to be not solid. So what you're having in Austria, which is very, very heavily oriented towards Eastern Europe, who are their natural economic neighbors and partners, is a realization that Erste Bank, which is basically First Bank translated into German, has been on the edge for a very long time. And everyone has pretended it's not a problem, and now the pressures are beginning to build. So the fear certainly must be contagion, because if anyone wakes up and says, well, if that's the story for Erste Bank, what's the story for French banks in Spain? What's the story for French banks' exposure in Italy, etc., etc., etc.? So the whole thing is just a house of cards waiting to come down at some point. And all that is happening is that the public are being gouged as much as possible to finance the banks by, illicit charges, excessive charges, penalties, all this kind of stuff. And yes, the banks are going to have to increase their provisions for legal expenses because they have to defend themselves against their clients who are suing them for having robbed from them in the first place.
That's the long and short of it, isn't it? And as sorry?
I mean, I would suggest to anyone who wants to understand more about banks to take the name of any of the top banks and enter the words fraud, money laundering, crime, fines, legal expenses, etc. And they will find all of the names up there with multi-billion-dollar numbers. And I guess the most interesting one recently has been Paribas, which has been accused of basically sanction busting and fined $9 billion by the Americans. Although one can definitely look at that number and say, was it influenced by the fact that France still wants to remain friends with Russia at a time when the Americans would much rather that they weren't?
Well, again, this is a kind of unfolding story. Unfortunately, you're exactly right with regards to the past abuses of these banks, so to expect anything different from them now would be folly, I think. But we can look at some of the stories about what's coming up. For example, this from Bloomberg, ECB summons bankers for catch-up as stress test looms, because, of course, European bank stress test time is here again. But just as a counterbalance to that, Euractiv.com has up a article, Europe's bank stress tests were unreliable, EU auditors say. Surprise, surprise, the 2011 tests conducted by the European Banking Authority turn out to be a bunch of hooey. You know, who would have thunk it? So, again, let's put as much stock in these stress tests as we need to, which is pretty much nothing. It's just for show, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right.
Different version.
Yes, exactly. Well, all right. So I think we'll leave that there. Again, that's a developing story that maybe we can catch up on at a later date. But I think that's going to do it for this edition, unless there's anything else on your radar that you'd like to talk about before we go.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention your excellent work on the Federal Reserve. You've been fairly quiet for a little while. There's been a sort of slowdown in the flow of shows, but anyway, I had the chance to start to look at it. As I said, I hadn't finished going through it last night, and I think it's one of the most important things for people to understand. When I read and understood it, and I did it first of all through G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, it was like a huge electroshock to me, because having worked in the financial sector most of my life, I had never really understood it. And when I did, I realized that the world was completely different from what I thought it was, and controlled in a completely different way. And that led me down the paths, amongst other things, to having an interview such as we're doing today to communicate these things.
Well, I think sorry. I just want to say I couldn't agree more. This is such an important issue, and you're right. There have been so many people blazing the trail before me. G. Edward Griffin, Creature from Jekyll Island, Bill Still and his work with the Money Masters and other documentaries. So I'm just adding to that conversation. There's plenty of other resources out there, but I really do hope people will understand just how central this issue is, not just to finance and economics. It's not just about numbers and things like that. It is truly central to the way we live our lives. And if I can impart anything on that front, I think I'll have done something for the service of humanity, because the question of what is money and how we define money and who gets to issue it and how it gets created and destroyed is the central question of our entire lives. And until we understand that and take that power into our own hands, we're going to continue to fall for the same scams and the same tricks, and the same people are going to aggrandize themselves at the expense of everyone else. So that's the point of the documentary. So I do hope people will, if they watch that and they like it, I hope they'll get that link out to other people to help expand the understanding of this.
Yeah, I agree. If you love your children, you must understand this, because it determines completely what their future life will be and who controls their future life. And you would like, normally as a parent, that your children control their own lives. But when you understand the mechanisms that are used and realize that your children's lives and ours are controlled by others very effectively and increasingly on a global basis, there has to be a point where people start to push back and say this is not acceptable. And if I can make one recommendation, James, what you did on the 9/11 conspiracy to make a very short video, I thought was excellent and had a very good viewership. If you could do something similar for as such a sober subject as the Federal Reserve, I think that would be a great thing, and I think it could very well go viral very quickly. So good luck and congratulations on what you've done.
Thank you. I was afraid you were going to say that. I was afraid someone was going to say that. Well, I'll see what I can do. At any rate, we'll leave that there for this month. Once again, people can check out your work, genevabusinessinsider.blogspot.com. They can find out more about yourself and the services you provide there. So we'll leave it there for this month. David L. Smith, thank you again for your time.
A pleasure as always, James. Thanks a lot.